When you look at a huge mountain range, it's easy to just see it as, well, scenery. But it's so much more than that. These are the Earth's original fortresses. Today, we're going to dive into how these massive walls of rock have literally walled off entire civilizations and shaped the whole course of human history.
All right, let's just jump right into it. We're all used to seeing political borders on maps, right? These neat, clean little lines. But what is it about a massive physical mountain range that makes it so much more powerful than just some lines someone drew on paper? Why does it have such a huge impact on who we are and how we live?
Well, the thing is, mountains aren't just rock and stone. They are the planet's original walls, built long before any human ever thought of building an empire. They slice up the world and they dictate everything: the flow of weather, the path of rivers, and ultimately the story of civilization itself.
So to really get a grip on their power, we first need to be super clear on what a natural barrier actually means in the world of geography and politics.
Okay, so here's the key takeaway. These features, they don't just make travel a little bit difficult. They fundamentally stop or channel human movement. They create a kind of natural container for a society, defining the exact space where people can live, where they can farm, and where they can build their world.
This brings up a really fascinating shift in how we've thought about borders over time. For most of history, we didn't have these sharp lines. We had frontiers, these kind of blurry transitional zones. It's really only with the rise of modern countries that we started sharpening those frontiers into the precise political lines we call boundaries today.
And hey, this isn't just about the borders between countries. Think about Russia's enormous Siberian wilderness. It's basically a giant internal wall that's challenged Moscow's control for centuries. Really difficult terrain can completely tear at a country's unity, making it incredibly hard for a government to actually rule its own territory.
Okay, so theory is one thing, but how does this actually play out in the real world? Let's take a look at an absolutely fascinating case study, where a mountain fortress didn't just protect a people, it basically created a culture that's unlike any other on the planet.
So, meet the Basque people. They live right here, in what you'd call a peripheral location, totally isolated by the massive Pyrenees Mountains that separate France and Spain. For literally thousands of years, these mountains have been like a natural, almost impenetrable shield.
And this is just a perfect illustration of that mountain fortress idea. Because they were shielded from all the invasions and migrations that swept across the rest of Europe, the Basque language, Euskara, actually survived. It's what's known as a language isolate. That means it's a living linguistic fossil, completely unrelated to any other known language on Earth. It's an echo from a time before Latin, Germanic, or Slavic languages even existed. Just amazing.
And you know what? This isn't just some isolated story. This pattern, where you have these distinct groups in really hard-to-reach places who want their own autonomy, that's a theme you see played out all over the globe. The geography fosters a unique identity, and sometimes that identity creates real tension with the larger country.
Which, of course, brings us to one of the biggest, most debated questions in all of geopolitics. How much does our physical environment actually dictate our fate? Are we destined to be who we are just because of where we happened to be born?
Okay, but here's the thing. Even though mountains are these incredible fortresses, they're not totally impenetrable. In fact, the very thing that makes them such a great wall, their huge scale, also creates these points of incredible strategic value.
So let's just recap that process real quick, that mountain fortress effect. First, the mountains create a barrier. Second, that barrier helps create a unique identity. And third, that identity can end up challenging the larger state. Simple, but powerful.
And now for the twist. Because no matter how big and scary a fortress is, it always has a weakness. It has to have a point of entry. It has to have a gate.
And for mountains, those gates, well, we call them passes. They are the narrow, often really dangerous pathways that cut right through the rock. They are literally the doors in the fortress wall, and for thousands of years, controlling these passes has been the entire game of military strategy.
So that leaves us with this final, really critical question. If a mountain range is the wall dividing two great powers, that pass is the only door. What happens when control of that one single door becomes the most valuable and the most fought-over piece of real estate on the entire planet?
All right, welcome back. Last time, we talked about mountains as these massive, impenetrable walls. But, every wall has a door. So today, we're going to find those doors, the strategic gateways, the mountain passes that have literally dictated the rise and fall of empires for centuries.
So to really get why one little path through the mountains can change the course of history,
We've got to start with this core idea from geopolitics, the deep, deep connection between a nation and its landscape. You see, for thousands of years, rulers didn't just see mountains as, inconvenient bumps on the map. Oh no, they saw them as the world's greatest defensive walls. They deliberately drew their borders along the highest, most impossible ridges they could find. But hey, what good is a 1,000-mile wall of rock and ice if your enemy can just find the one gate and walk right through? That's the Achilles heel, and it's been the single greatest obsession of military strategists forever. And these gates, well, they have a name, and controlling them has often meant controlling the fate of empires. They are, quite simply, some of the most valuable real estate on the entire planet. So a choke point is basically where the landscape itself just takes away all of your options. It forces everyone, we're talking traders, travelers, entire armies, onto one single, narrow, totally predictable road. You can't go around it, you have to go through it. To really, really grasp the power of these places, we've got to look at one of the most audacious, almost insane, military campaigns in all of history. Okay, picture this. It's 218 BC. The Roman Republic feels totally safe, totally secure, protected by this giant wall of the Alps to their north. But a Carthaginian general, Hannibal Barca, he had other plans. He decides to attack Rome by doing the unthinkable, marching his entire army, complete with war elephants, directly over that wall. But as his forces snaked their way into those winding mountain passes, Hannibal quickly figured out that his true enemy wasn't the Roman legions waiting for him on the other side. Nope, it was the mountains themselves. The choke point he was trying to force had become a weapon aimed right back at him. This crossing wasn't a single battle, it was a brutal, weeks-long gauntlet. The passes were so narrow that hostile tribes could just hide in the cliffs and pick his men off. The cold was so intense that men and animals literally froze to death. And devastating rock slides, some natural, some man-made, could wipe out entire sections of his army in a heartbeat. And the price for forcing his way through this single geographic door was absolutely staggering. By the time Hannibal finally descended into Italy, he had lost nearly half of his entire army. Not to Roman swords, but to the brutal, unforgiving terrain of the Alps. Okay, so Hannibal's journey shows the incredible cost of forcing a pass. But what about the immense, world-shaping value of controlling one? For that, let's meet the legendary Khyber Pass. For millennia, this 33-mile-long corridor, cutting through the massive Hindu Kush mountains, was pretty much the only practical way for armies and trade caravans to move from Central Asia into the vast plains of the Indian subcontinent. This pass wasn't just a route, it was like a conveyor belt for history. The Persians, they marched their armies right through here. Alexander the Great led his legions through on his quest for the edge of the known world. The Mughals swept down to establish a dynasty that would rule for centuries. And much, much later, the British Empire would fight bloody wars to secure this exact same gateway. For thousands of years, the strategy was simple. It was absolute. If you held the Khyber Pass, you held the keys to a subcontinent. You controlled the flow of armies, sure, but also of silk, of spices, of ideas. You decided who got rich and who was left out in the cold. It was maybe the most fought-over mountain pass in human history, all for that one simple reason. It was the door to immense power and unimaginable wealth. So these two stories, separated by thousands of miles and different eras, they really teach us a fundamental principle of history and of strategy. These two examples really bookend the whole strategic problem, don't they? Hannibal's desperate crossing of the Alps shows the incredible, almost ruinous cost you pay to force your way through a mountain door. And then the long, long history of the Khyber Pass shows the ultimate prize, the immense value of simply holding the key. The lesson here is crystal clear. The great mountain ranges of the world, they act as nature's fortifications. But the passes, the choke points, those are the gates in the walls. And for all of recorded history, controlling those gates has been one of the single most important goals for any rising power. Which brings up a fascinating question, right? What happens when an army is actually at the gate? How can a small defending force use the terrain itself, the cliffs, the narrows, as a weapon to stop an invader 10, even 20 times its size? Well, that's where military strategy and geology collide. And it's exactly where we're going next. Welcome back. Today, we're wrapping up our deep dive into the geopolitics of mountains by looking at how they can be turned into a weapon. So, let's start with a classic military puzzle, one that strategists have been obsessed with for centuries. How can a tiny army possibly defeat an enemy 10 times its size? I mean, how does a defending force, completely outnumbered and outgunned, not just hold on, but actually win? Well, the secret isn't just better training or fancier technology. The real answer lies in using the landscape itself as an ally. It's about turning solid rock and steep slopes into your most powerful weapon. So here's the plan for today. We're going to explore how terrain becomes a weapon. We'll look at the modern military playbook for mountain warfare, see how attacking forces try to break through, and then we'll wrap up our entire three-part story on the power of mountains. Okay, first up, we need to get our heads around a really critical military idea, something they call the force multiplier. So what is it? A force multiplier is basically anything that lets a small force punch way, way above its weight. And in the mountains, the terrain itself is the greatest force multiplier there is. I mean, just think of the most famous example ever, the Battle of Thermopylae. A handful of Greeks, led by just 300 Spartans, used a narrow pass to hold off the entire Persian Empire. That pass was their force multiplier. And look, this isn't some new idea. Strategic thinkers have known forever that the physical world isn't just a backdrop for a fight, it actually dictates the terms of the battle. It tells you where you can fight, how you can fight, and, sometimes it even decides who's going to win before a single shot is even fired. So let's see how modern militaries use this. So how does this whole concept work in practice? Because this isn't just ancient history. Modern military doctrine gives us a very clear step-by-step playbook. If you actually look at NATO guidelines, they reveal how to turn an entire mountain range into a fortress that's almost impossible to break. And the secret? It's not about trying to defend every single inch of ground. That's impossible. It's all about controlling the critical points, the passes and the high ground, and then using them to your advantage. And this breaks that strategy down perfectly. You don't need a huge army. Instead, you use small, agile teams to hold the most important terrain. From up there, you just watch the gaps, which forces the attacker to spread out, become vulnerable, and basically walk right into your trap. And really, the ultimate goal here isn't to beat the enemy in some kind of fair fight. No way. The goal is to wipe them out before they can even really fight back. The terrain does half the work for you. This is the classic mountain ambush. I mean, according to NATO's own mountain warfare manual, the terrain itself creates the perfect trap. It allows a single platoon to neutralize a much, much larger force that's stuck in a valley below, with absolutely nowhere to run and no way to effectively counterattack.
Okay, so if the terrain is such an unbelievably powerful weapon for the defender, how on earth does an attacker get past it? What do you do when the mountain itself is your enemy?
Well, in modern counterinsurgency, the number one tool for defeating a mountain fortress isn't a bigger gun or a faster jet. It's something much simpler, and honestly, way more effective. It's a road. And this is the critical point right here. Building a road is a strategic act of war. Like we've seen in places like Afghanistan, a road doesn't just connect some isolated valley to the capital for trade. It allows an army to move troops rapidly. It systematically dismantles the defender's single greatest advantage by robbing them of their isolation. It completely transforms the battlefield. And that brings our three-part look at the immense geopolitical power of mountains to a close. Over these last three explainers, we've really seen them play three distinct, powerful, and sometimes contradictory roles throughout all of human history. They're not just passive landscapes waiting for us to cross them. They are active forces. They divide empires, they create choke points for trade and war, and they act as the ultimate weapon for anyone who knows how to use them. And this is our final takeaway. The outcomes of our greatest conflicts, the shape of our empires, the flow of our economies, so often, these things are decided long before the first battle ever starts. They're decided by the lay of the land itself. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. Our journey through Geopolitics and Geography Week continues, and tomorrow we are shifting our focus from the solid ground to the open ocean. We're going to be exploring the invisible highways of the ocean, the great trade winds, and we'll see how these massive, predictable patterns of wind created the very first truly global economy and built the incredible maritime empires of the Age of Sail.
Before you go, we'd love to hear from you in our community poll. And hey, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a single day of this series. We'll see you for our next explainer.